All right, everyone, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructure for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, the Michigan Virtual University, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, as well as MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. So before we introduce today's presenter and the topic of his presentation, an important disclaimer for our research webinar series. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU or MVLRI unless otherwise specified. So before we get started, I am going to introduce Jayson. Let me bring up his bio. Let's see. There we are. So Jayson Richardson is joining us from the University of Kentucky, where he is an associate professor. He is also the director of the Center for the Advanced Study of Technology, Leadership, and Education, or what's commonly known as CASTLE. You can find it at www.schooltechleadership.org. And he researches leadership, technology, and international development. Jayson teaches in the only program in the US and possibly the world dedicated to the leadership side of school technology integration. You can contact him at jason.richardson@uky.edu and also available via Twitter at JaysonR. And Jayson, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. He's going to be talking to you about voices of virtual school leadership, the challenges and advice he has to offer based on his research.
Catherine, it looks like Verona might be having an issue. So I don't know if you want to deal with tech issues on the side or how you want to do that.
Definitely, we'll do that.
Is everyone else able to hear us? Can you just go to the chat and say hello? Okay, it might be an individual issue. Okay, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Randy. And thanks, Brad. All right, thanks for that introduction. My name again is Jayson Richardson, and I was asked to present this research, which was conducted with two other researchers, Dennis Beck as well as Jason LaFrance. Both of those gentlemen have done other work in the field of virtual schooling. If you're interested, one of their articles recently published was in the Educational Administration Quarterly, looking at virtual school internships for pre-service principals. That's a really fascinating article also. So if you're interested in that, I'd be glad to give you that citation. So when we look at the literature on school leadership, we know a few different things. So we have a lot of information out there about what makes leaders successful. We know that they're pivotal in setting the direction of the school, in developing people, staff, teachers, as well as developing the entire organization. So Leithwood and Ryle wrote a lot about that and did a lot of analysis on some of those indicators that most impact student achievement. And we know that the leader matters. When we look at virtual school leadership, we have a little bit of information out there. So we know that that these things are different these kind of leadership practices are different in a virtual school than they are in a brick and mortar school, but we don't really know how. So we only hear it as one-off situations or anecdotes from individual leaders. And we know that K-12 and blended learning programs, they're morphing. Virtual schools are in every state now, I do believe, but they can take on different models. They can be charter schools, a single school program, a district program, or a shared program, or a nationwide program. So we have all different models. So we're sort of talking about different things at the same time, which sort of muddles the water a little bit. When we look at challenges of school leaders, we know that there are lots of them. We know that they could be student related, they could be school related, they could be leadership related. And this is traditionally in the brick and mortar K-12 schools when we think of those. So we know that the common issues that leaders are facing include meeting the needs of diverse student populations, accountability, assessment. At the school level, we're all about social justice. I'm part of the University Council for Educational Administrators, where we prepare school leaders, and one of our main focus has been on social justice and worrying about this idea of culture and climate in schools. We also know that tech integration is a huge issue in traditional brick and mortar schools. It's also an issue in virtual schools. We know that, of course. We have leadership issues as far as being an instructional leader. How do you do distributed leadership with teacher leaders? How do you plan for succession for other folks to take up the reins? And how do you evaluate teachers? So we have lots of research on this as far as what issues are most prevalent. But when we start thinking about virtual schools, we don't really have that much research, but we have a lot of non-empirical stuff. There's a lot of studies out there, and our paper talks about some of these, about how in virtual schools it's important to have a shared vision and purpose, that we need to promote school effectiveness and worry about student achievement, and we need to worry about staffing and funding. But the literature that exists doesn't really collect any data. It's just folks saying this is important. And we can all agree on it, but we don't really know what that looks like empirically. So we started looking at this, my fellow colleagues and myself, looking at what challenges do virtual school leaders face in their unique contexts, and does it differ by different types of contexts, and what can we really take away from this? So we had two research questions that guided this research study. One was looking at what specific challenges do virtual school leaders have, and how do they really address them? So how do they overcome these? As you'll see here, we had, I believe that's 18. I have to do my numbers check there real quick. Participants in this study. Was kind of interesting, some of the demographics. When we look through here, we had them all over the country, which is a good distribution. But we look at what I have highlighted here in yellow, as far as the number of years experience as a traditional administrator versus a virtual school administrator. You'll see a lot of these folks have not been administrators in a traditional brick and mortar school at all. And if we look at the experience they have as a virtual school leader, we'll see that, heck, that's not even that much. Some of these folks have as little as a year or even a few months in the system. So these folks are new to the entire career, as well as this the nuance of the career. You'll see here that in the green that we have a few folks who are a few years underneath their belt. And you'll see here in the blue, we only have a few folks that have a few years. But even when we look at those folks in blue, those what we might even call long-termers, those folks that are more veteran in the field, they still don't have any traditional brick and mortar school experience. It's all virtual school experience. And of course, a few, if we want to say quite veteran, we only had two that were nearing the decade mark. So what did we do? What did this study look like? Advanced Ed is an accreditation body that accredits schools all around the world. We tapped into their database to find what schools they accredit and try to compile that list. They said there were 130 accredited virtual school programs in the United States. When we started looking a little bit closer, we started seeing there were a lot of duplicates. So about 32 of them were actually programs that were within the same district. or that they no longer existed. So when we pulled out the list and tried to make it a little bit cleaner, we only had 98 possible virtual school programs that were accredited by Advanced Ed. So that was our starting point. We emailed all of these leaders through 3 rounds of emails asking for them to participate. We wanted as many folks as possible. Heck, we would have interviewed all 96 if folks said yes, but we got as many as we possibly could. Interestingly enough, we had 6 virtual school leaders refuse to participate, and some of the reasons were quite interesting. Some of them, they wanted to get permission from their corporate office or from a head office. Some folks asked for money to participate, and some just said they just didn't have the time and they weren't interested in academic research because they were worried that we would be twisting some of the data to meet some sort of political agenda. So I suppose they were worried we might have a negative impact on their schooling and their initiatives, which I can understand based on the popular media. So if we look at the entire data set, we had about an 18% response rate, and we interviewed these folks via telephone for about 45 to 60 minutes. So we had a semi-structured interview protocol. We just asked them general questions as far as challenges. We were not leading in any way, so we didn't ask, do you have X or Y or Z challenge? We just asked, what challenges do you have? And we just started recording it and talking about that as it rose organically. So our data analysis, being researchers, we sort of try to make sure that what we say is valid. So we did a lot of iterative reliability. If you're interested in this stuff, I'll be glad to go over it. But we did a constant comparative method where we keep looking at the data over and over again to make sure that we don't have any new themes coming up. We coded at the end about 766 different codes for all these folks. And between the 3 raters, again, that was Dennis Beck, Jayson LaFrance, and myself, we reached about a 94% agreement rate on what the codes were. So that's pretty good in most of the research bodies that we care about. We do have a couple of limitations here. So of course, we're only looking at Advanced Ed website, their accreditations, the schools that they accredit. So there are all kinds of other schools out there, but we needed to start somewhere. So we had a real problem trying to find a population, if you will. So this is the one that we chose. We tried to use INACOL, and I can't remember, I have to look at my notes, but we had some limitations with that. So we, again, chose Advanced Ed. And we only have the perceptions of a select few, so we didn't get to talk to all 96. We were only able to talk to 18, so that's a limitation. So maybe those folks that didn't talk have different challenges. That's possible. And of course, we have a small sample, and we would have loved to have talked to more folks. But again, we can only talk to as many folks as willing. So here are some of the themes. So if we look at what challenges virtual school leaders have, the first one was funding. So 94% of the folks said they have big challenges with funding. You see staffing is next, accountability, time, parents, and professional development. So we'll talk about this a little bit as we go on. I'll talk about I think the top 4. And you can always ask me questions about the other ones if you like. What's interesting here, again, we didn't ask, do you have issues with funding? We didn't ask, do you have issues with staffing or accountability? We just asked about challenges general, and these are the ones that they organically came up with. So after they talked about, for example, time, we would say, what other challenges do you have? And then they would just give us more of these. So it's not that all of the leaders didn't have time issues. It's just that we only had 10 that naturally brought that up as their issues. And we did that for a few different reasons, mainly that we think that those challenges that come to the forefront of a person's mind are those that they think are most important, or the ones that they really think are most pressing on their career. So let's look at funding. What we found 3 different issues here. So that the funding model is a real challenge for these schools. Marketing and recruitment was a problem, as well as being underfunded and unfunded expenditure lines. So here are some things we found out about the funding model. So here are some quotes here. We're funded only for completion, that's students' completion. So for 6 through 12 months, that means we don't receive any money until a student completes the entire course. We don't receive funds unless a student is promoted into the next grade level. So those folks that drop out, they don't get any money. Another principal talked about how they only receive 80% of the funding that a student receives in a traditional schooling. So there seems to be an assumption by the funding model that it costs less to do things in the virtual environment. And some of these leaders noted how that was a problem. Principal B noted that each month they have to report out their active enrollments, and then they get paid out in 10 installments. So over the course of 10 months, they pay the cost of the students for that month, as long as they're with the school. If they leave to go to a different school, then of course that funding is gone and it follows the district. So funding follows the school, funding follows the student in that case. Principal Q talked about how they're totally self-funded, so it depends year to year if the school is going to use us or not. So they have a set budget. And another person here said that they get a legislative line, so we use that and serve as many students as we can with that given percentage, given set rate, and they try to of course meet as many students as they can. So you start seeing that there's all different sorts of models coming up here. In Principal P's school, they talked about how their state, they get funded if the students get all the paperwork in. So they start, we get them started before the first of the month so they can count them at the first of the month. We get them all started on the paperwork in the day after the first of the month, and we can't count them for another 30 days. So if a student is just a little bit deficient, you lose funding for that kid, which causes a problem also for a school to rely on a student that way. Another principal noted that if a student finishes a class in a really short amount of time, they're no longer in school, they don't get funding for them anymore. So they still have to pay for the same amount of class time for the class, which is interesting if we think about that in a brick and mortar school. If a student is accelerated or they pass the content, we still get paid the same amount, but in this school here, they do not if a student finishes early. Principal O talked about we're not able to capture any kind of federal funding and those types of things. So we have a line item in the budget that we're paid on a current enrollment basis. So they don't really have any guaranteed funding in that case, which was, I imagine, quite challenging. So that's the funding issue. When we started asking, when these leaders started talking more about staff development, we started seeing that they had 4 main themes about how do you get staff to understand what quality online instruction looks like, how do you hire the right people, how do you supervise, evaluate, and how do you remediate them if they have any issues, and how do you engage them, and how do you collaborate with them in this environment. So let's look at some of these quotes on these sub-themes here. So one of the issues here is having staffing that understand what virtual learning does and what it can look like, how it's an evolving picture, and so that it's still a little bit scary for the staff because they can't really quite understand what it can do for students and how it can look like. And to a small degree, we still have some staff who think we're trying to replace them by just putting the kids on the computers. So this is obviously a principal who is in charge of a blended program where students take part of their program in an online environment and the rest in a face-to-face environment, a traditional brick and mortar school. We see that there are, of course, hiring challenges. Principal Q talked about how all the staff and the managing people is difficult. So you have to find the right people and make sure they're committed to the cause, and helping them collaborate with each other is a way that that is positive. That all parts all of those parts are hard. Principal Q talked about we end up at 400 students for the year, but I have a budget to hire teachers and staffing in June, July at the latest, but I don't know what those numbers are going to be. So it's a big fat guessing game until all the dust settles about the 3rd week of September. So it's going to be one of our biggest challenges. So imagine if a brick and mortar school didn't know what the student level was going to be and they just had to hire randomly for the staffing needs. I imagine that would be quite stressful. So if you have more students than you need to be ramping up your teaching staff quite quickly. Principal E talked about how the biggest frustration is, or the biggest concern is that they don't have control over the part-time teachers that I would if they were all full-time. So this principal here talked at length about how the part-time teachers aren't quite as committed and have a different set of expectations than teachers who are in the school for full-time work. Principal B talked about how the biggest challenges with staff is that I don't always have the opportunity to walk into a classroom and see how things are going. I have to trust that my staff members are doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, that they're actually sitting at home in front of the computer, or they're visiting with the family during the day. He's not able to monitor that by the minute-by-minute interactions. So there's a lot more trust involved when they're completing this. This study here is actually a 2-part study. Another one we talked about the role differences and how they got their jobs. So some of the principals actually talked about how being online was a little bit easier than being face-to-face because of the learning management system. You have a lot more data points to look at interactions or to look at what a principal's doing or teachers doing in their class and with the students. But some principals noted how it was a real problem because they might be thinking in the paradigm of a traditional classroom where you can just pop down and see what's going on in real time. When talking about engagement and collaboration among teachers, this principal here talked about, I think that staff engagement is something we have to be very on top of in an online environment. I don't feel like I see that as much in traditional school because while it can happen, maybe I slack off on what I do with the students from day to day. I just think it's more obvious when it starts happening in traditional school than everybody's sort of seeing and hearing what's going on all over the building. So this principle here is really talking about you don't know who's talking to who or when they're talking to who, and what the results are of that collaboration. Because they could be, on instant message, they could be on Facebook groups. You just don't know how teachers are collaborating amongst each other. So you just can't see them in the teacher lounge and see what's going on. There's a big issue with accountability. So a lot of these leaders talked about how there was stringent oversight for their schools. There's a lot more accountability for students, that you have to know what the current demands are, and yet you have to maintain a high level of quality in these online environments. So let's look at stringent oversight here. Principal A talked about there's a higher level of transparency on what we do in contrast to the traditional school, i.e. a brick and mortar school. I think we're in the spotlight in terms of any little thing that rises to a surface a lot easier. So we have to do our due diligence to do a really good job to maintain our quality and support for our students. And keep in mind, this is one of the reasons why some of the leaders refuse to participate in the study, because they are under a spotlight and they're worried that if one little negative thing came out, that would be, off with their head, if you will. We also see that there's an issue with student accountability. They started to talk about how they have the same accountability in the virtual environment as the state requirements are the same. For standards, testing requirements are the same for students. Our students have the same graduation requirements as far as credits are concerned. All that's the same. But they talked about how certain things are different as far as going back to the funding issues. If you have students in, for example, advanced placement classes, you have to mail them the lab equipment. So it's a little bit different. So or textbooks, you have to be a little bit more proactive. So those kind of things were on the forefront of some of these leaders' mind. Another big issue they talked about was time. So how do you really maintain a work-life balance? So that was a common and fun topic to talk about. So Principal J talked about, I was thinking at times there are boundaries problems because it's not like traditional school where you're there from 8 to 5 or 7 to 5. It's not like traditional school administrators that we don't have the same issues. Maybe there's more boundaries for them than virtual school leaders because you're always on. You have a cell phone and students can call you any hour, any day. So they talked about the need to be present and to be present at a virtual environment. Principal I talked about how if you take a leadership at a school or a school district at any level, it's more of a full-time job. Clearly, we don't have sports or bands or park events to attend, but because we have a 24/7 access, we have to make sure that we plan our time accordingly, and we work through the summer as well. Principal K talked about because we're open all the time, there's expectation that we're available at 3 o'clock in the morning to answer questions. And I teach classes online right now at the University of Kentucky, and I get that. I couldn't sleep last night, and I was up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and a student was asking me about an assignment. So kind of odd. So I was responding to that student to try to alleviate the stress at that time, because maybe I'm online and they think they can talk to me. Principal J talked about they think I'm just in my bunny slippers at home, and truth be told, I may be, but it's because it's 11 o'clock at night and I'm still working. So that's kind of a funny little quote there. Another issue they talked about was parents. How do you communicate with parents? How do you overcome parental misconceptions about online learning? So that was a interesting one. So Principal I talked about we clearly can't gather all of them in a gym or a football stadium and give them an orientation and talk to them about what's coming up. We don't have board meetings that they can attend, so we rely a lot on electronic communication tools, phone calls, direct emails. One of the things that came out is that these leaders had to have strong communication skills. So in our other article that I was referring to, how they got the job, it was because they were strong communicators, because they have to be very versed at how do they word something and how do they get that message across in a written or a video context so it does not get misconstrued. Trying to overcome those misconceptions, Principal N joked that a lot of this has to do with that girl on TV singing in her pajamas, and I think that creates a false impression of what online learning is really like. Principal B talked about how the parents are working as learning coaches with the students. They're responsible for making sure that the students are actively engaged in schoolwork. Occasionally we have students who enroll with us whose parents are looking for a way out of accountability, so they enroll their students. They're signing in for the attendance, but the students are not completing any work. And we contact the parents to talk about those problems. We know that the student only spent 2 hours a day, i.e. from the LMS, doing the work, so they should be studying 6 hours. So it's a big challenge. But it's also, as you see, the flip side is it's also a way to hold parents as well as students accountable for the commitments they made to the learning process. We see here that professional development was also a challenge. Only a few folks talked about this, and some of the people actually said that it was easier to do professional development in a virtual environment in a virtual school because it's much more flexible, it's much more self-paced for the teachers, it's continuous, it's timely, it's relevant, it's based on teacher feedback, and it's individualized. So those discussions were really powerful as far as in a traditional brick and mortar school, we'll usually have professional development for the entire faculty body. But here they can do it for one or two students to say, one or two teachers to say, you actually have an issue with communication. So let me try to give you some professional development on how you might be able to communicate more effectively with your students. So that was interesting. Here, talking more about how it's easier. I think we have a lot of advantages that we offer lots of professional development to our teachers. We can do any hour on a Monday, and it's not just taking away from their teaching time, and their students like it, taking away from their time and taking away from their students like they do in brick and mortar settings. We don't have to worry about a substitute because we can offer professional development anytime for these teachers. Principal B noted that all the professional development is based on what the teachers are struggling with, things that I need to address as a school leader. Timely and relevant. And having worked with school leaders in a lot of brick and mortar schools, we prepare professional development options early in the year. So it's not flexible to the needs and we don't necessarily shift it. We not hire high paid consultants to come in to talk about Common Core and make that our theme for the year or whatnot. But in a virtual environment, it's not. It seems to be a lot more responsive, which is interesting. So there are some implications here. We see that virtual school leadership really isn't just brick and mortar leadership in a virtual environment. It's different. We have a lot of the same issues, but they're contextualized different. So we see that the technology can really transform the interactions. They look a little bit different than they do in a face-to-face environment. Technology school leaders really see the big picture that maybe they're not able to see in a traditional school because of either other obligations that tear them away from looking at teaching and learning. Could be sporting events, it could be infrastructure issues, it could be community engagement initiatives that they're working with. And we also see that pre-service leadership programs are struggling with this. So we don't see a lot of programs that are actually offering experiences in virtual schools. So when people want to go into this career path, they don't really have an idea of what it looks like. So we know what leadership looks like. We know what some of these main accountability issues look like, but we don't know what they look like in this kind of environment. And then these people are not obviously prepared. And you can see from the demographics that we have a lot of these folks with no traditional experience, but yet we're asking them to be virtual school leaders. So we might be doing them a disservice. So we see that funding, there are similar problems, but the model of the virtual really changes the funding challenges. So whether they're getting paid at the very beginning as a set line item by the state, or whether they're paid by the student number, which when is that student number actually taken? Is it on a day-to-day? Is it completion? Is it each month? Each one of those models do have an issue. We see there are some similarities with staffing problems, with accountability, with funding, but we see there are a lot of differences with professional development as well with funding by program, which is kind of interesting. Some of the recommendations that we see we really need to focus on pre-service administrative preparation. We need to even do this in-service administrative preparation. A lot of these folks are taking these jobs and they may not have the skills needed. They don't really have social networks where they can tap into other folks and understand what's going on, what's working well, what's not working well. I think there are different organizations out there that are doing a good job and they're tapping into those, but not everyone knows that they exist. So when we're talking about how they develop themselves, a lot of them were, well, it's just on Twitter. It's not necessarily in a robust professional learning community, professional learning network. And we see that there's a lot of empirical research needing to be done in virtual school leadership. A lot of it is, again, just a case study of one or a more anecdotal stuff that we see in the newspaper. So we need to do a lot more research on that. So here are my contact details. And again, the co-authors, we have Dennis Beck as well as Jayson LaFrance. You're more than welcome to contact them as well. If you're wanting the paper, I'll be glad to send it to you individually if you contact me, or if you have access to a library, you can locate it that way as well as in the chat window, and I will be glad to put that out there again. And there is the journal. Yeah, Ray, exactly. I totally agree. There are a lot of programs out there that really do nothing with regards to technology, virtual learning. I'm a director of CASTLE, the Center for the Advanced Study of Technology, Leadership, and Education. It's founded by Scott McLeod. You might know him. And we probably offer the only program in the country that focuses on technology in schools, but that's even more focused on traditional schools. We hit on virtual learning and online learning, but that's more in the context of here's an option versus how do we actually prepare these folks for that actual career path. And I don't think other folks have access to the audio, so if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Yep, Tracy, I have you queued up here, and I will send you the paper right away. Ray talks about there's another issue thing about leaders in brick and mortar schools and the impact on virtual schools. Can you talk more about that, Ray? What do you mean? As far as preparing them for to understand that there are programs out there? And Randy, I just sent you the article. Catherine is asking a question about do these folks have ed leadership training? All of them did. So all these folks that we talked to had certification. So they did have some training in educational leadership. So they were certified principals. So one of the common misunderstanding is perhaps they're not, but that misconception was thrown out the window with this group at least. Diane, the paper's on its way. True, Ray. That is true. They do make daily decisions that impact their sister virtual programs, especially if you're in a supplemental program. So one that feeds into the traditional school, they just don't quite see how all those things mesh together. Do you want to talk about current ed leadership, like saying? No. A lot of these folks didn't really seem to be tapping into the educational leadership literature. It's much more about the virtual school literature. So they knew a lot about teaching and learning in online contexts and communicating in online contexts, but they didn't really seem to talk a lot about leadership in general. However, when we talked about how they got their job, which is in the other paper I was referring to, they did talk about they were hired because they were visionary, because they had some experience with online learning because they could speak to stakeholders about the importance of online learning and funding, good stuff like that. So they understood some general leadership um, concepts, but I'm not so sure they were tapping into that as their regular professional learning network. And David is on his way. Jayson, I just sent you yours. So are there groups that meet to support each other? We saw that a little bit. So we would see that folks would find people, like-minded people through national conferences, and they were saying that the conferences didn't really meet their needs per se, and they would be more following folks on Twitter who were in the same ilk. But there didn't seem to be any larger effort to bring these folks together and to support their needs. I mean, they did mention things, of course, like INACOL, which is always out there, and those kind of conferences, but they didn't really talk about how they're getting supported on a day-to-day basis. So I think there is a need for that, and universities can step up by offering professional development opportunities for virtual school leaders or offering ways for them. Webinars such as this um, are great for trying to get the voices out there and try to get folks to understand what this all looks like. Sarah is on its way. Good point, Ray. Universities would need to understand online learning. We see that they don't. Of course, I'm part of, like I said, the University Council for Educational Administrators. We do a lot of research on what school leadership looks like, and rarely does that touch on technology. So that's one of the limitations of our field. We've been beating the drum for years now, saying that more research needs to be done on how does technology impact teaching and learning. What's the role of these new technologies? Could be virtual class learning. It could be LMSs. So there's a lot more research needs to be done out there. Yeah, and good point, Ray. If ed leadership programs don't get it, no one will. So, and we're the ones supposed to be leading the changes. And we also clump them together. So, Verena, you mentioned that K-12 online and blended learning, they're two different beasts, right? We sort of put them together as, hey, here's online learning. And it really annoys me that we don't really think about there's different needs for different definitions. So if we're talking supplemental, if we're talking fully online, it just looks differently. Even my university has a real problem with that. So for example, we use I'm multitasking here. So Ray is on its way. Um, Canvas as our LMS, but you can do so many different things with it. So you could actually have classes every Saturday in Adobe Connect just like this, which I do, and I see my students with little pictures. We use all cameras here. I notice none of us have a camera except for myself, but it's face to face. So the way we start thinking about that's a face to face meeting, but you're not in the same physical space. So when we think online, we usually think someone is talking at you and you're not engaging. But Adobe Connect, I think, is a great product for putting students into breakout rooms. They can chat just like this. They can do Google Docs integrated right in here. So there's a lot of ways that this becomes a really robust learning system, and folks just think that it's going to be all asynchronous. And when they think about online learning, they think it's all asynchronous. They don't quite understand there's all different options, all different flavors, if you will, and based on pedagogy and based on student body and teacher preferences. Yeah, Diane, it is about the leader trying to make themselves aware of what these learning environments look like. It changes everything. So they know better how to support teachers, parents, and students when they know a little bit more about what online learning and blended learning looks like. Y'all are blowing up my email over here too. Yeah, thanks, Diane. If you want to, if you have any questions about the paper or about the other one, which is on how do these folks get a job, what kind of training do they have, I can send that one out also. And this is being recorded too, so I'm sure Catherine will send out the link. Any other questions? I didn't easily have that article queued up, Diane. You're going to make me now find it. That's all right. No worries. I have to actually make sure that one's actually published yet. So I will look in my files here. And Diane, that one's actually still in press. So I don't have a copy of that one. But if you follow me on Twitter at Jayson, Jaysonr, I'll post when I get it, and then you can send me a direct message, and I will be able to send that out to you. So my Twitter handle is just JasonR. Any other questions? I see Dave is still typing. Ah, good. Dave was asking a little bit more about how do they evaluate online teachers. Yeah, they were talking about how that was an interesting challenge and how they really found it easier to evaluate teachers because of the LMS. They can look at how they were grading student work, which we can't really do easily in a traditional face-to-face brick and mortar school. They talked about how they can actually see how long the teacher was engaged in teaching, direct teaching, or with emails to parents or emails to teachers or emails to students or conversations with other teachers. They were just talking about how a lot of that data made it a lot easier to look at what teachers were actually doing and maybe to see where their weaknesses were. So they could see if maybe they weren't contacting students enough, trying to be proactive enough with the students, maybe they would give them some professional development on that. So that was kind of interesting. Or they could look at some of their lessons and say, well, you're not really scaffolding your lessons that well. Or I looked at your quizzes and they're not really flowing from the content. So how do you make those two things link a little bit better? So most of the folks talked about how this is actually an easier concept than in a traditional brick and mortar class. Yeah, David, that's one of the issues they talked about is that the literature talks often about how virtual schools we should be there's two sides to this. One say that teaching is good teaching and it should look the same in virtual schools as well as brick and mortar schools. But what we see, especially in these interviews, that that's not necessarily the case. That it looks different. I mean, the basic premise is there, but it's contextually different. So the technology changes things up a little bit. So like some of the evaluation tools may not be relevant. So for example, you might see if there might be a rubric out there looking at does the teacher, make eye contact. I remember we used to look at those sort of things when I was evaluating student teachers. That doesn't really make a lot of sense in this kind of environment. Or does the teacher give higher order questions? So if it's all asynchronous, it doesn't necessarily flow that way. So how do you ask those asynchronous, those higher order questions in a medium that's not in real time? So it just looks a little bit different. Um, oop, going quick. Joe's asking, bring up a point. I missed a question from Ray about what might ed leadership programs for virtual school leaders look like. That's a great question. I know there's some talk of trying to create programs. I've seen some online universities trying to create programs for virtual school leaders, but I'm not so sure the quality or how well they're doing that. but I would envision that it would look like traditional educational leadership, but then contextualized in the virtual environment. So I think there's a lot of things that we really need to understand, like distributed leadership or human resources or school law. A lot of those things are part of it. But then again, school law, we really need to start worrying about the tech part of the school law too. So we need to really infuse our traditional school leadership preparation programs with technology as well as preparing them for these technological environments. I think we totally miss issues when we look at teaching legal issues in our courses. We don't talk about cyberbullying. We don't talk about online harassment. We don't talk about tracking. We don't talk about student records in an online environment. And those are the kind of things we need to prepare traditional school leaders for. But then we also need to prepare our virtual school leaders for those exact same things, but it just looks a little bit different. So I'm not a proponent of trying to create two tracks. I think we need to integrate them better. So if a traditional school leader wants to go into a virtual school leadership role, they can do that, and vice versa. So we're not just pigeonholing people into one mode of schooling. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, civil rights, we talk about that all the time. NPR was just having a story about like Twitter shaming. How do we do that? And what are some of the ethics of that, right? So what happens when that takes it out onto the schools? Or kids, recording videos in traditional schools and then posting them online. What does that mean? We don't talk about that with traditional school leaders. And I'm sure we're not talking about that with virtual school leaders either, because that might look a little bit different, but kids can easily post other types of videos online. So what does that mean? And what are the legal ramifications for the school? So I'm not so sure we talk about some of those things. Mm. Yeah, Brina, you talk about classroom management. Yeah, it does look different. But you do have issues of ethics and protocols in like for discussion boards or in online classes like this. So how do you navigate and how do you manage, like for example, if I had a synchronous classroom with 30 students, how do I manage that? What does that classroom management look like? There's a lot of systems you have to put in place, like microphone use, or what happens when you have a question, or how do you talk to someone else, or how do you get students to not be chatting with one another, or not be checking Facebook when they're supposed to be engaging in the lesson. So those sort of things are there, I think, the classroom management issues. But again, it depends on what kind of online learning we're talking about. Are we talking about synchronous, asynchronous? Are we talking about supplemental? Are we talking about blended? We can't put them all together. Joe, did any of the interviewees talk about informal mentoring opportunities they have benefited from? I'm thinking of Virtual School Leadership Alliance, now non-university, non-degree granting opportunities. Yeah, for the most part, they said that's where they're getting all of their professional development experiences is through these sort of non-university based opportunities. But that's what was interesting is they have to take the lead on that. So it's not as far as it was it doesn't seem to be systematic yet. It's all individual experiences, I guess, individual desires to learn more about those professional development opportunities. I'm looking in here, seeing if I forgot any questions. If I did, feel free to post them again. Looks like the chat is coming to an end. If anyone has any lingering questions, comments.
While people think about their last questions to ask Jayson, on behalf of MVU and the other attendees to this webinar, we really thank you for your time and your expertise that you shared with us today. It's been good use of 50 minutes for us to think about these issues and how they impact the work that each of us are doing. So thank you, Jayson, for sharing that. And thank you all for people who have been able to take your time out of your day to attend this webinar. Just as a quick update, the online and blended learning research community has a meeting on November 8th of this year from 1 to 4 p.m. That is at the iNACOL Blended and Online Learning Symposium in Orlando, Florida. Hope to see lots of you there if possible. Also, as other avenues for us to kind of connect with you, please don't forget about the MVLRI podcasts, our virtual viewpoints. There's a link for where you can see and download our most recent podcasts, as well as if you haven't looked at our blog posts on our blog program, and that's worth checking out. I know in the last couple of days or weeks we've produced a couple of blog posts that look at the prevalence of online learning at universities, using some of the information that was published in the Digest of Education Statistics for 2013, as well as the IPEDS data that's available. I think we have a series of about 4 of them, and maybe we have 2 or so out. But pretty interesting stuff, we think, in terms of how higher ed is moving into that space and what it means potentially then for K-12 schools as they prepare students to be college and career ready. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those documents. And then on next week, on Tuesday the 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern, we'll have another webinar, Communication Practices in K-12 Online Environments, presented by Victoria Rose Reich from Penn State University. Hope that will work in people's schedules to be able to attend that session. If you look on our webinar page, there's an iCalendar invite that if you put download, you can easily add that to whatever calendar you're using, and hopefully we can see you there. And finally, in case you don't have our contact information, here's a list of our contact information. Jayson, if you wouldn't mind just one more time putting your email address in the chat for people. Again, thank you for taking the time to attend. It's been a very fun session. This has been recorded, and we'll be working to putting that up live on our website so that people can access this on demand after the fact. So any last words, Jayson?
No, this is fun. I really appreciate the interaction. I really appreciate all the comments. But feel free to reach out on email or on Twitter if you have any questions or on any other resources that we might have. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, well, thank you for accepting, and very good time.
Thanks all.